All right, so we've worked our way through Romans chapter 1. We're now going to move into chapter 2. But we need to realize as we do that, we're really not leaving chapter 1 behind. We're expanding on chapter 1 and explaining it further, which is going to be the case for quite a bit of the book of Romans here, at least at the beginning. I think really we almost have to go back to verse 16 through 18, pretty much as keeping that as the context for the whole book. And my premise pretty much is that that's the theme. I think I might change my mind or change that a little bit, but I think as I've thought this through, the theme is also grace, faith, salvation by faith, by grace through faith. But that really ties back to Romans 1, 16 and 17 and 18. Again, it's not a change. It's just a further explanation of that as we get into these chapters. And even when you get into chapter 6, where Paul says, don't take me the wrong way on these things. Don't think that this means that I am saying, therefore, we don't worry about doing what God requires of us. And we can do whatever we feel like and still be in good shape with God. He's not saying, he says, if you're taking this that way, that anything goes as long as you say you believe in Jesus, boy, you've really made a twisted mess of what I'm teaching, basically, is what Paul says in chapter 6. So as we go through this, we have to realize that whatever we get out of this, one thing Paul is not, there's two things that are pretty clear that Paul is not teaching. He's not teaching that we can be saved and grow in grace and faith by grit our teeth and determined to do better. We covered that in chapter 1, and that's going to continue to be explained further as we go through the next few chapters. And he's not saying that anything goes, because clearly in chapter 1 he's already said, when we don't have faith, what we do is we begin to live a life that is outside of God's will. And God doesn't give us grace to overcome. It's available, but it's available to the humble. And if we are rejecting his gospel and not walking into a relationship with him that creates true righteousness in us by faith, then he gives us our own way. If we want our righteousness to be based on our own ability to keep his law or keep our own law that we've decided is something we like better than his law, even that we can't keep. So anytime we base our righteousness on a law, we are going to be outside of God's grace, and we are not going to begin a relationship with him based on those things. We're not going to begin a relationship with him based on ignoring his commands either. And we can go to Galatians, where Paul says, in chapter 5 of Galatians, Paul talks about a summary of what he was saying here in Romans chapter 1 and what we're going to get into further in the book of Romans. He says, Christ has liberated us to be free. Stand firm then, and don't submit again to the yoke of slavery, to the law, is what he's been talking about here. Take note, I, Paul, tell you that if you get yourselves circumcised, which was what they were, the part of the law they were had preached to them in Galatia after becoming Christians, then they had some people come in and say, oh, well, you're not going to truly be saved if you don't get circumcised. And so they were attempting to bring themselves under the law for salvation and for righteousness. And Paul said, if you get yourself circumcised, Christ will not benefit you at all. If you base your righteousness on the law, Christ benefits you not one bit. Not one bit. In fact, he says somewhere here that you have fallen from grace if you do this. So Paul is actually going to the Galatians. He says, you have fallen from grace. You've believed, you've put your faith in God, and now you've begun to turn back to these weaker rules and regulations as a form of righteousness, and you've fallen from grace. So get back. Get back on track here. Come back to faith, come back to grace, come back to the gospel. And there's a lot in Galatians. You can read Galatians, and if you read it in that context, you'll get an even better understanding and in a quicker summary of what he's saying in Romans, in pretty much the entire book of Romans. Although in the later part of Romans, he explains how all that looks in a greater detail, what it means to walk as a Christian in the righteousness of God. So, but back to Romans here, we have, he says, so therefore any of you who judges is without excuse. So Paul is not, what he's doing is, I believe my premise in all of this, my hypothesis, if you want to call it that, I think it's a educated summary based on what I have read elsewhere from the Apostle Paul, and my understanding of how this is working as he lays his case out here, is that he is still working off of Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, and he's saying, therefore, when you who judge others, you are without excuse because you're doing the same thing. So again, he's talking about taking your view of righteousness and saying, well, those people are not doing what the law says to do. They're clearly, as we just read in the end of chapter 1 there, they're clearly idolatrous. They're clearly not walking in faith. They're clearly not living a life that is devoted to God, where God is the king of a person's heart and life. And so people who would do such a thing are useless. They're dogs. They're inferior to me, as I, a faithful one, am practicing the law of God. And I do believe that Paul here is catching there was a group of, I think I might have mentioned earlier, there was a group of Jewish believers who had been sent out of Rome by, I believe Claudius, and they had been out for 5 years, and they were coming back, and they were reestablishing their presence in the church in Rome. And probably we're trying to bring some of their traditions. Probably we're looking at the Gentiles ignoring so many of the traditions that they still thought were worth keeping, and that they really thought their righteousness was based in. And possibly one of the reasons God sent them away for 5 years in his sovereign decision to allow Claudius to do that was to give them a chance to give the Roman Gentile church a chance to develop. And that's my conjecture. I don't know that that's the case, but I think it makes sense to develop outside of this influence that had been in so many other churches of the Jewish believers trying to impose the law on all of the Gentiles. They just couldn't seem to help themselves. They thought of them as inferior to the Jewish people because they had a lot of trust and confidence in themselves in a lot of ways, and in their keeping of the law. And that's what Paul is breaking down here. So we see here that Paul is eliminating trust in the law, and he's actually telling them, if you think you're superior, if you're looking at other people, thinking you're doing a better job of keeping the law than they are, look at yourself. You're not doing a good job either. And again, that's not the point. The point is, are you submitting to the righteousness of God by faith? So he's correcting them here. Again, anyone who's having confidence in their law, he's correcting their thinking and telling them, don't judge other people for not wearing the right clothes, for eating certain foods, for not celebrating certain holy days. Don't judge them and think of yourself as superior, because those things are not where your righteousness abides. And in doing so, you're showing that your confidence is in your faith in yourself, faith in your ability to keep the law. And we just broke that down as we went through chapter 1, where Paul is eliminating that as a way of righteousness. So if you think you're righteous by keeping all these things, you're doing the same thing that you're accusing other people of, and you're not obtaining righteousness because you're suppressing the truth of the gospel.